Hi guys, welcome back to part two of the video on Bamp. So we're talking before the break about sort of this slightly lonely existence possibly of the grandfather who's staring into the distance, thinking about the past. He's pottering about with nothing really to occupy his time, just looking at his watch and hoping for time to pass. In the next bit of the poem though, we do see a sort of a less lonely and a more outspoken picture of the grandfather. So his pockets are for special things he's forgotten. In his wallet is a license from the Queen. He can say what the hell he likes and you can't do nothing. It's not in speech marks or anything, but we almost imagine the grandfather saying that phrase. And some people commented that sounded quite funny. Other people said they got a sort of negative image of him. He's sort of quite self-righteous and boorish in the way that he spoke to other people. And then there was a few other bits in the next stanza that people picked up on. A severe hearing problem around those he doesn't like, gaps in his smile and stories, a head full of buried treasure. Okay, I'm putting on the screen now some points people made about those lines. So you can read through those. I'm not going to read them out verbatim, but three, I guess, quite vivid images in different ways. The humour of pretending not to be able to hear people, which people could relate to. The metaphor of the head full of buried treasure, and the kind of dual meaning, I guess, of gaps in his smile and stories. He will have gaps in his teeth or whatever, and his stories might not be totally coherent, but the more sort of metaphorical resonance of those gaps. So when he tries to tell a story about his past, this student writes, it doesn't quite make sense because there are parts of it that are missing. They're disappearing from his memory and probably lost forever as everyone involved dies or forgets. So there's a sadness there. So while a head full of buried treasure might be quite an exciting image and a positive image, treasure is obviously positive, and these are treasured memories or treasured time, maybe that the grandkids spend listening to these stories. There's this sadness as well. And buried treasure keys into that, as well as the gaps in his smile and stories, of course, because it's buried. A head full of buried treasure might suggest that actually lots of these treasured memories and stories, he's not telling the stories to his grandchildren because he's buried somewhere, it's lost within his mind. So an image there you can read in a more positive or a more negative way. And then we come to the final stanza, and it's back to this image of him twiddling his thumbs so furiously, it's like he's knitting air. It's only him can hold the air together. Well, one student asked, what does the last line mean? And a few people had ideas about that, so let's talk a little bit about that last line. It's only him can hold the air together. Well, as the first comment on the screen suggests, on the surface it's him twiddling his thumbs. We get this description of him twiddling his thumbs, which is sometimes a kind of a way of saying someone is bored, they've got nothing else to do. But this student says the implication is it also describes how empty the author's life would be without his grandfather. So you've got, often in poems we have layers of meaning, and we can see that here. That's surface meaning, he's twiddling his thumbs. That kind of implied meaning, it's only him can hold the air together. How do you hold air together? There's a suggestion, connotation of something impossible or magical, which keys into a semantic field that we're seeing through the poem. And then behind that we have maybe a different kind of truth. He's holding the air together. He's holding the world together, or the life together. As the student puts, the author's life would be empty without the grandfather. And the next student picks up on that idea. He is the kind of thing that makes everything make sense. He makes everything work. So we can read this line as the speaker acknowledging the importance of his grandfather. And I guess most people, either from personal experience or from speaking to other people or reading, will be familiar with this idea of of a bereavement, and suddenly it feels like things don't fit together anymore, things don't work anymore, and that's the interpretation that the second student here is putting on that line. She writes, if he passes, then everything might start to crumble. And again, then that links back to some of those hints of mortality that other students felt they found elsewhere earlier in the poem. So, yeah, you could read this is a line that works on different levels, and as the third student on the board here, you could see it as quite a touching line. The way this writer, if it is the writer, might be grown up, but still the grandfather has this kind of talismanic quality. As a student puts it, shows a real idealisation towards him. Well, that's quite a good comment to sort of move on to talk about our overall impression of the character in this poem, because the poem is not a narrative particularly, it's a description about one person. So what image are we supposed to get of this grandfather? Which links to the question that some document that I sent around with your poem, which you can see in blue there at the bottom of the screen. So here's one student's response. A quizzical depiction. He seems rather odd, yet wise, yet experienced. So I'm glad that people are picking up on this idea that the character isn't just one thing, just as none of us are just one thing. And actually, that bullet point there could be quite a nice plan for answering the exam question. You could almost have a paragraph on odd, a paragraph on wise, a paragraph on experienced, and they're three different possible ideas about this grandfather. We might feel as well about, okay, feelings about the speaker's grandfather. And that's what I want to talk about just last before we finish, because that's something I find quite interesting here in terms of responses. So what were your feelings about the grandfather, or what feelings did you pick up on in terms of what the speaker feels about him? Let's have a look. So here's some feedback, some of which we've touched on already. So as well as the point that we've finished looking at the poem with the idea of idealisation, really positive feelings about the grandfather. We've got the idea he's had a good life, he's an interesting person, his family enjoys spending time with him. The person is in awe of the grandfather, every little thing he does. Without him they'd fall apart, would not be whole. And you can tell, one student writes, the whole poem was written with fond memories in mind. So lots of positive responses, and that makes sense. Most of us have positive feelings about our grandfather. And there's something interesting, I think, in this question about the gap. Whose feelings about the speaker's grandfather? The speaker's feelings and other people's feelings. And I can really see in this poem as a character who, depending how well you know him, or what your relationship is to him, well, that might affect how you feel about him. Because all of these students, and they're in the majority, have got this idea of very positive feelings about the grandfather. But there's another way of looking at things. Let's look at these two comments. I think the poet has made it clear that the grandfather is the type of person that only cares about his own opinion. Is disrespectful towards other people. The reader feels unfavourable towards the grandfather, creates a negative image of a man who believes everything's created for him and everything he does is right. And then the next student takes it further. The grandfather's general vibe seems like that of a boomer, and goes on to talk about immense self-importance, as though the world revolves around him. This man has lived a life and wants everyone to know about it. And I really like the fact that from this poem, and from most poems, certainly good poems, it's possible to take these opposing views. So one view of this grandfather with his stories and his head full of buried treasure is that what an exciting life he's lived. He's got great tales to tell. Isn't that fantastic for his family that they're lucky enough to be able to share this treasure? But then we've got this alternative view. Well, it's treasure to him. Yeah, it likes the sound of his own voice. It will tell you about these memories, and it'll also tell you if you don't like what he says, tough. He says what he's liked. Yeah, he can say what he wants, you can't do nothing. So two different views, almost diametrically opposed views from the same line. And as we said before, you could take it in other directions as well. Buried treasure suggests the treasure is lost below the surface. Then we have a feeling of sympathy, a third different feeling that comes on. And really, I think that is quite a nice sort of way to think about approaching a question like this. If in the unseen poetry exam you get a question where the poem looks at a character and you're asked to write about that character, especially if it mentions feelings, well, you can think whose feelings. The speaker's feelings might be positive, love, someone he needs, he's holding the air together. But the reader's feelings might be different if you read the poem the same way as those two students that we just looked at. And then what about the subject's feelings? You could pick up on that, couldn't you? Self-importance. I can say what I like. Yeah? Or maybe a feeling of loneliness, as one student picked up in stanza 2. That idea, he's staring closely at the middle distance because he's nothing else to do. And actually, that would be a nice way to approach an exam question like this. Your paragraphs, if you had time to write 3 paragraphs, might talk about 3 different possible ways of feeling about the character, depending on whose feelings we're talking about. And if you have time, and absolutely only if you've got time, because you're coming to the end of a long week, you've been working hard, but if you've not used your full hour and you've got time, well, maybe pick one of those viewpoints, those perspectives, and write a paragraph using this structure, which we've practiced before, and there'll be PowerPoints you'll be able to find on Show My Homework to go through it, and have a go at writing a paragraph as part of the answer to that question. Okay, that's it for today then. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hope you enjoyed the poem. I'll be back next week with another poem for you to look at and a bit more work on Macbeth as well. Talking about the Macbeth work, I know some of you had issues accessing the Massalit website. It seems like it wasn't working during the day yesterday, then later on yesterday it started working again, and now it seems to be down again. So I'll look into that, see what's going on. But don't worry too much about that. The important thing is you're doing the bits of work that you can do, and obviously once we're back together again, hopefully quite soon, and certainly before your exams next year, we'll be going over all the texts in loads and loads of detail. Okay then, so have a good weekend all of you. Stay safe and keep smiling, and hopefully I'll see you really soon. See you later.